however, had been mostly unaware or oblivious to our tragic story, often failing to see beyond the regime's double talk and totalitarian facade. Often, Western governments were too busy seeking trade and business with the ruling mullahs, habitually looking away from the flagrant violations of human rights within Iran and closing their eyes to violence such as the assassinations of dissidents and regime opponents in foreign lands. Contrast the world's 30 years of silence on the tyranny of this regime to the extremely loud and well-organized protests frequently directed at my father's government in the 1970s. The difference could not be more distinct or disturbing. Then, the world seemed quite attuned to and concerned with the issue of human rights in my country. Today, with 30 years' worth of full graveyards and more on death row than ever before in Iran, the global silence on the stunning human rights atrocities committed by this supposedly religious regime has been astonishing and disappointing. It is quite frustrating for me and for many of my compatriots to conclude that the global standard on human rights seems to be capriciously administered and certainly has been discounted for Iranians since the establishment of the world's only modern-day theocracy. In recent months, the world's tone has begun to change, in no small part due to its frustration with the clerical regime's unresponsiveness to various United Nations resolutions and demands. Recently, Secretary Clinton cited human rights as a motivating factor in her announced targeted sanctions against 8 members of the power elite of the Islamic Republic. It was a good first step and long overdue. However, there's much to do and time is pressing. The humanitarian crisis within Iran is now speeding beyond its borders, with thousands of political refugees being held in camps in Iraq and Turkey and other countries. Many of these refugees now exist in a stateless status. Members of my team have been recently to the camps in Iraq, and the stories of torture and retribution at the hand of the regime that these Iranis have to share is quite disturbing, and unfortunately, all too common today in Iran. Moreover, these refugees provide probably the best witness testimony to the human rights abuses of the regime, and they need to be heard by the international media. Over the years, I have held countless meetings with heads of states, prominent members of international legislative bodies, such as the British House of Lords, the United States Congress, and the European Parliament, during which I have alerted them all to the inevitable fact that sooner or later, the tyranny, radicalism, militancy, and terrorism of the clerical regime in Iran will end up beyond the Middle East. Unfortunately, history is witnessing the exact migration of such ideology, not only in Europe, but even here in America. The world can ill afford to view such problems as only regional or a disagreement among Muslims. They are now global problems. Calls for jihad have not come only from mosques in Damascus or Beirut. They have also come from the suburbs of Paris, London, and Madrid. We only recently witnessed a failed jihad plot to detonate a bomb in Times Square in New York, and now the entire continent of Europe is under travel advisory for unspecified terror threats. Now you can add to the clerical regime's blood-soaked record a new malevolence, Iran's nuclear program. It appears that while the world will not concern itself with the human rights abuses in Iran, or the exporting of militancy by the clerical regime in Iran, its nuclear efforts suddenly seem to have captured the world's attention. The world has been awakened to the lethal combination of having the world's #1 sponsor of terror and chief financier of militancy the world over having its finger on a nuclear trigger. The nuclear issue has become top priority for shuttling diplomats from Western capitals and at the United Nations. However, I am here to tell you, it is not necessarily the critical or most potent issue when it comes to motivating the Iranian citizens who see their economic misery and human rights conditions as a much greater justification to defy the clerical regime. Finally, some governments are not taking the tougher stance vis-à-vis the regime and echoing the protests of and lending the support to Iranians back home. This welcome change of events came as a result of last year's post-election fiasco in Iran, giving rise to what is today known as the Green Movement. For the first time in 3 decades, the world took a much closer and deeper look at Iran and Iranians. The world media, YouTube, and Twitter played a great part in bringing never-before-seen images of our people's struggle against their oppressors while informing the world about their true aspirations. Quite dramatically and overnight, the world witnessed the coming of two masks, that of a double-talking, reform-faking regime, and that of an Iranian nation reaching to the world and courageously showing its rejection of a failing totalitarian regime. Of course, none of the wall-to-wall coverage of last summer's news reports was a revelation to Iranians who had witnessed the very same treatment over the years. Many of you may not know that the exact same popular uprising and violent response by the regime occurred, this time outside of cameras, under former President Khatami, the so-called reformist president, in 1999, after which Khatami declared his pledge to preserve the regime at any cost. So Iranians know full well that the regime will not hesitate to kill as many people as necessary to hang on to power. And the world should also be clear on that. The difference between 1999 and today is that the youth in my nation are armed with mobile technology and Twitter and can immediately broadcast to the world disturbances and atrocities as they occur. The Islamic Republic can no longer abuse its citizens behind a veil. Today, committed and courageous Iranians march together, waging an unprecedented campaign of civil disobedience and defiance against their rulers. Most importantly, they have maintained a remarkable discipline in refraining from violence. This is our path, and ultimately our way out of the economic, social, and political dead end the clerical regime has brought to our homeland. What is to be done? Diplomacy, although exhaustively attempted, has failed to deter the clerical regime in any way. Instead, it continues its prolongation tactics while proceeding with its nuclear program. The Western powers fail to truly understand that the regime views its guarantee of survival in having the ability to equalize its power under a nuclear umbrella, thereby neutralizing the superiority of conventional foreign military forces and reaching its goal of regional dominance and hegemony under a modern-day Shiite caliphate. With nuclear capabilities, the clerical regime hopes to finally force the United States out of the region as a whole. This grand scheme and scenario is evidently unacceptable to the United States, as well as its European and regional allies. As another scenario, a military confrontation or strike at Iran would be disastrous. Having often stated my vehement opposition to it because of the unfathomable prospects of war and ruin against my homeland, it is my belief such an attack would not only be ineffective against the regime's well-entrenched and well-scattered nuclear program, but more importantly, it would eliminate the chance of a peaceful resolution of Iran's political situation. It would severely set back the cause of democracy in Iran and thereby bring a much heavier human and financial toll to Iranians